Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I'm going to take a better look at how you can go about reference mixing and certain practices and techniques that you can incorporate to get the best results. So in the previous video I talked about selecting your reference track, and this track here was an example I used to talk about selecting the reference track. And so in that video, I said that I thought Cyclone by Baby Bash would be the best reference track to use for this track. And so that is the track I will be using in this video. So the first thing you want to do when you're reference mixing is get any effects you want on the master on the master. So right now I have a limiter, and this is just on the default settings so that any weird things that happen don't damage my ears or anything like that. So the limiter isn't actually going to be doing anything to the final output of the track as I mix it. It's just kind of in case any really loud, sudden, kind of unexpected sounds that would maybe damage my ears. So I have that on there. I'm going to add a wave candy on the spectrum view. And then I'm also going to add a Vox and Go span, just as another, different type of spectrum. And I'll be talking more about how I'm going to use these as I go on. So you really want to make sure that you don't have any effects that are changing the sound of the master when you are reference mixing. You can see I don't have anything that would be affecting the output of the sound. I have Edison to record it for this video, and then I have the limiter to catch any peaks that go above 0. But while I'm mixing, none of the peaks will actually get near 0. So that's important. You want to have any monitoring tools like wave candy or span, but nothing that's going to change the sound. And then what you want to do is bring in the reference track. And I want the reference track to be up at the top so I can easily, turn it off and turn it back on and solo it or whatever. So I'm going to right click on the top track and go down to select Insert One. So now I have an empty track up there that I can put the reference track on. And now I'm bringing in the reference track, and you want a good quality version. This is one that I got on iTunes. But you want to get it off iTunes or Beatport. Like I said in the previous video, you don't want to rip it off YouTube or anything like that. So you should have a nice high quality reference track. Because she moves her body like a cyclone, just like a cyclone. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to route that through a mixer track. But I'm not actually going to put any effects or anything on it. I only want to route it through a mixer track so that I can adjust the level. Because as you can see right now, it's peaking at 0, and if I try to mix my track that loud, my peaks are going to be going above 0 because this track has been mastered, and before it was mastered, it was probably peaking a decent bit higher. Depending on the song and the genre, it could be up to 6 or even more decibels. So I'm going to reduce the level of this track by 8 decibels. So I'm going to drag that fader down to -8 decibels. So now I should be ready to start mixing. And basically while I mix, I'm going to alternate between soloing the Cyclone track and then looking at my track to determine certain different things while I mix this. So as I usually do when I mix, I'm going to take all of the level faders of my different sounds all the way down to 0. And this way I can just objectively mix them in one at a time and have everything be nice and straightforward. So if I turn all of those down, and you don't want to turn the level of the reference track all the way down. You want to keep that at -8 or wherever you decide to put it. -8 is usually a good idea, just to ensure that you have plenty of headroom. So now if I mute the reference track in the playlist, you should hear nothing when I play the song. And now I'm pretty much going to mix it the same way I did in the leveling process video, but I'm going to base my decisions on the reference track. So I'm going to unmute the reference track, and I'm actually going to solo the reference track. And I'm going to load up the 808 kick pattern. So you can hear if I play the song, I will play the reference track, and if I play the pattern, well, I have to unmute that, but if I play the pattern, you'll hear my 808 track. Now, kicks and basses are kind of tricky to get the level right. So I will be using span to help me out with that. And if you're a beginner, using these different spectrums will really help you out quite a bit, just to make sure that your levels are right. Because you aren't quite used to listening and really noticing small differences in loudness and all that. And so utilizing these tools can really help you out. And so I'm going to change the settings on this to reduce that average time. And I am also going to turn on the second spectrum and set it to max. So now when I play this, I can see the maximum values, and I can see a quick sustain of my 808. And this is just really going to help me get the levels right in that bass. So if I play the song where the 808 is playing, you can see that it's kind of sustaining at about -39, that 808 is. It decays pretty quickly. Mine I don't think decays that quickly, but it is sustaining at about -39. So I'll play my pattern, and I need to turn that level up. And if I wanted to get a better idea using my ears, I could throw an EQ on the track and use it to isolate the bass frequencies. So I can hear that the bass sustain is about even, but the punch is a lot less in my track than in the reference track. And so I can hear that, and then I can also see that on the spectrum here. You can see that the max is kind of all the way up at 27, but if I look at the max on mine, it's down at -36. So this is where I might use an EQ to kind of boost those punch frequencies a little bit more. And get it to sound a little bit closer to that sound. And that punch is actually deeper than what I'm doing here. So you can see it's a bit better. And then I might just boost that a little bit to, get the level a little bit closer. So it looks pretty good on the spectrum, and I can hear that mine is a little bit more untsy than that one, so I might cut the highs a little bit, like the high bass. So that sounds pretty good. I'm not going to try to perfect it any more than that, just because for the sake of the tutorial not taking a year. But depending on how much you want your sound to match that in the reference track, you can adjust it and spend a lot of time just getting everything perfect. Especially for the bass. The bass is kind of the most common problem that people have, and it kind of is the hardest to get right if you don't really know what you're doing. A lot of people tend to put way too much bass in, so it's really good to just use these spectrums and solo the bass using a low pass filter, so you can hear it and see it and all that. So I'm quite happy with that. I feel like I got pretty close. And now, if I really wanted to match that kick with the high end of the kick as well, I could basically change that low pass filter to a high pass filter and really listen to the kick in the track. And then listen to my kick. And my kick has a different character than the kick in that track. The kick in that track sounds a little bit saturated or distorted, and mine sounds a bit more clicky, but if I wanted to get rid of that kind of a little bit more, I could cut here, and maybe I could boost the click. So I'm not going to get my kick to sound exactly the same as that one, just because the character is different between the two kicks. But I could use EQ to really kind of get it as close as possible. But for me, the bass is the most important on that kick. The bass is really what I want to get right. So if I wanted to, I could do that high pass and kind of try and get things to sound as close to that kick as possible. it would be helpful if my kick sounded a little bit more like that kick in the first place. But this sounds alright to me. Now, if you're a completely beginner and you're watching this tutorial from the beginning, just for right now, stay with just the pure leveling. Don't worry about EQ, don't worry about any other effects. Just focus on getting the basic levels of your sound set properly so that they are as close as possible to those levels in your reference track, and the frequency balance between all your sounds is good. And nothing's too loud, nothing's too quiet. Just because, I really do think it is important to focus on that before getting into the EQ and other effects. But in this video, I will be kind of touching on using some of the other effects just because this is a reference mixing video and I'd like to explain the overall process a little bit. So if you are a beginner, for now, stick with the leveling and then progress through this tutorial practicing each step as you do so. So, just don't worry about the EQ and other stuff for now. Focus on setting the levels just right. So the next sound that I want to set the level of is this bass here. So if I play the track and look at the spectrum again, I can see that it kind of peaks at -36 when that higher bass plays. It's just above -36. So that's what this bass is. And right now it's quite too high. So I'm going to reduce that. And I'll just see if I can get it right. So that looks pretty good to me. I might actually reduce it a little bit just because this one sustains and the one in the track doesn't sustain. So that's about good. And even if you're reference mixing, you might have some problems with getting the bass just right. And if you do, I definitely recommend you check out a different video from much later in this tutorial. It's actually a part of one of the bonus sections, and that video is reference mixing bass from the bass bonus section of this tutorial. So after this video, definitely feel free to jump ahead and watch that video because it's not going to be too advanced or anything. It just points out some problems you might encounter while reference mixing bass. So that can definitely be useful, so I definitely recommend you watch that after you watch this video. So now I have that bass sub-level set, I have the 808 set, and I'm going to set the level of the bass drop as well. And there isn't really a bass drop in the Cyclone track that I'm aware of, so I'm just going to set it on my own. And I'm going to set it to be less than that bass sub by just a little bit. So there will be certain sounds, that you will have in your track that don't really match up with anything from the reference track. And those kind of sounds, you'll want to decide, you'll kind of have to decide how you want to mix those in on your own. So now I should have all my bass and kick different sounds mixed in. So if I, play my track instead of the reference track. You can hear that. So now that I have my kicks and my basses set, the next thing I'm going to do is the clap, because it's kind of a main element and it's kind of, a foundation. So I'd like to do the clap next. So I'm going to find the clap pattern. Okay, so here's my clap pattern. And I'll turn that clap up a little bit. And now I'm going to, listen to the reference track. So if you look at the song when I play it on, the spectrum here, it's not quite as easy to see the real level of the clap. So it's going to be a better idea to mainly use your ears and kind of also use this spectrum over here, because you can kind of pick that clap out a little bit better. I think I'm going to adjust the settings on that and just increase the decibel range knob. And yeah. So now I want to get my clap to match that level. And right now, mine's quite a bit more quiet. So I'll turn that up. So that sounds about right to me. You can hear that my clap has a slightly different character than the clap in the track. And if I were concerned about that, I could EQ it and kind of, get it to match the other clap better, the clap in the reference track. So, even just that small EQ is a little bit closer. But like I said, I'm not going to try to be perfect in this video. I just kind of want to, give a decent look at the idea of reference mixing and how to go about it. And I actually might boost that just a little bit. Yeah, so I think that sounds about right. So you can see that it's kind of not super clean. And you could high pass that if you wanted to, or just low shelf it to kind of cut some of that out. But again, if you are a beginner, just focus on getting the levels right. And that's primarily what I'll be looking at in this video. I do just want to touch on a few other aspects. And you can hear that this track is pretty dry, the reference track. But if you could hear a decent amount of reverb, you might put on the reverb and try to match the amount of reverb on your different sounds as well. So the next thing I'm going to do is look at the hat sound. And to me, I can hear that the closed hat is actually panned a little bit to the right. So I'm going to find my closed hat pattern, and here it is. And I'm going to pan it first. So, if I wanted to, I could spend a decent amount of time getting it perfect. But I don't really want to do that, so I'm just going to pan it, 48%. And then I can also hear that in the reference track. The open hat is panned opposite of that closed hat. So I'm just going to say, the closed hat we'll say is 50% right, and I'll pan the open hat 50% left. And now I'll set the level. After I've panned it, I will set the level. And you can hear that my hi-hat is brighter than the hat in the reference track. So if I wanted to fix that with EQ, I could. But I'm just going to leave it like this. And that sounds about right in terms of level to me. So I'm going to actually mute the reference track and listen to my track now. And, kind of toggle between them to make sure that things sound about right. So it sounds decent to me. And now I'm actually going to base my open hat off of my closed hat rather than listening to the reference track. So I'll start playing that right here. And then I might double check it against the reference track as well. And that actually sounds really close to the reference track. It sounds a little bit brighter, maybe a touch louder. And then I'll double check how my track sounds again. So that sounds pretty good. And like I said, I could touch it up with EQ to get it even closer to the sound of the reference track if I wanted to. And doing that is just really listening very, very closely and taking your time to adjust and boost and cut different frequencies until your sound sounds as close as possible in terms of the frequency response as the different sounds in your reference track do. So now I'm actually going to mix in the main saw lead sound because I'm going to save the crash and the ride for last. That's just something I like to do to make sure that the crash and ride sit in the mix instead of standing out too much. But if you wanted to, you could go for the crash and the ride next. But I'm going to go for the main lead sound. So I'll find that pattern in my track. And I'll try to match it with the lead in the reference track. Okay, so I found the high-pitched version here. So you can hear that it matches my sound pretty well.
Never sloppy and
And for this sound, you might be able to use span a little bit to see better if you needed to.
never sloppy and got an entourage and her own papa.
But it's not very clear, so you might stick to just this spectrum still.
Never sloppy and got a
And you can kind of see it,
never sloppy and got an entourage and her own paparazzi. Now that she
So mostly I'm just going to listen and try to get those levels about matched.
never sloppy and got a never sloppy and got a
And right now I sound a little bit too loud.
never sloppy and got a 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 never sloppy never 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 never.
So that sounds pretty close to me.
Never.
But you will hear that there's some reverb on that sound.
Never sloppy and got a
And there's not really any reverb on this one. So I'm going to set up a reverb send. Again, if you're a complete beginner, don't worry too much about this reverb and all that. Just mainly focus on getting the levels right for now. And then you can worry about reverb when you get to the reverb section of this tutorial series. But I do want to cover it just because this is kind of to cover all of reference mixing. So yeah, so I'm just going to listen and try to match that reverb.
never sloppy and got a never sloppy and got a entourage and a never.
So that sounds pretty close to me. I'm not going to perfect it like I've been saying for the sake of the video.
Never sloppy and got a entourage and never sloppy and got a entourage and her own. Never sloppy and got a
And if I find out it's too loud or something later on, I can always change that. So the next thing I'm going to do is this whistle sound. And I will listen to the chorus again because that's where it plays in this track. So that sounds pretty close to me. And I'm going to just add some reverb on that sound as well.
Now look at that number on the back of the
So that sounds pretty close to me. And the next sound I'm going to mix in is the pizzicato. So I need to find the pizzicato in the reference track. So I found it right here. And I need to find the pizzicato pattern of mine. And I've kind of been focusing on getting independent instrument sounding right and not paying attention to my full mix all that much. Normally I would be checking it against the full mix a lot more than I have been, because you do want to make sure that it fits in your track. But if you are following the reference track and your track sounds very similar in terms of the sounds and all that stuff, it should end up working okay if you're matching the sounds. So after I mix this pizzicato in, I'll check the whole mix and see how it's sounding. So I'll start bringing the level of that up. So you can hear that the character of that pizzicato is a bit different. It has a little bit more of the lower tones, but I'm gonna try and get it to sound about right. And maybe this would be a case where you should EQ it. I think I actually will do that. And I could perfect that if I needed to, but for the sake of the video, I'm going to not perfect it. So that sounds about good, and then I'm gonna add some reverb to that as well. So now I'm going to, listen to how my mix is sounding. It sounds pretty good. I think there's too much reverb on that saw lead. I feel like the hi-hats might be a little bit loud. So I might change that, but I want to listen to the pizzicato and see how the pizzicato sounds in relation to the other synths. And I feel like it's too loud, so I'm going to turn it down a little bit. So I'm going to double check that on the reference track again. Yeah, so that sounds closer to the reference track even. So I might have just not been listening quite closely enough. Now, the other sounds that I have to mix in here aren't really so much in the reference track, like this FX sound here. That's not in the reference track, so I have to decide how loud I want that to be on my own. And, it's really up to you to decide. The only real tip I have is err on the side of making it too quiet, because, this is just kind of an extra sound. It's not all that important to the track, and, if people are listening to the track and this little effect sound isn't heard very well, nobody's really going to care. But if it's way too loud or something, or even just a little bit too loud, people will notice that a lot more than it being a little bit too quiet. So I'm going to listen to the track and kind of mix that in. So that sounds pretty decent to me at that level. And I might actually even turn it down a little bit more, just to err on the side of making it too quiet. I'd probably want to EQ that some really, but I'm not going to in this video. Because, the bass sounds a little bit louder than it should be, and I feel like I could turn up the highs a little bit more, but I'm going to skip that in this video. And so next up I have a bass synth sound, and that's this sound here. So I'm going to do the same thing, I want it to be present in the mix, but I don't want it to be too loud. So that sounds like it's at a decent level to me. You can hear that it kind of matches the level of that effect sound, which is good. And I might actually turn it down a touch. I'm kind of going quickly in this video, naturally I'd really pay a lot more attention and double check the mix later on other sound systems. Especially since for this video I'm mixing in my headphones, which isn't something I'm particularly skilled at as much as on, speakers, monitors. And so now all I have left are the crash and the ride. And so, you can use the reference track if you want to. So, the crash sounds like it's panned to the right pretty far, and then I can pan the ride opposite the crash. And then, I can just do the same thing that I've been doing and try to get that level to match. The crash in the reference track sounds a lot different, so if I wanted to match it accurately, I would EQ it, but that sounds pretty close. And now the ride I'll just do based off of the crash. So that sounds pretty close, and now I'll just kind of focus on my mix and see how everything's doing. And overall, it sounds pretty good. I am hearing a few things that I would probably want to change, and a lot of that is because I didn't really EQ my sounds that much to match the reference track as well as I would have liked in other situations. But hopefully, I mean, it does sound pretty decent. I do think that hi-hat is too loud. But hopefully this video gave you an idea of how to go about reference mixing and how to think about it, how to kind of utilize a reference track really well. And another thing you might want to check is if you look at the frequency balance on the spectrum, kind of make sure that it lines up pretty well with your reference track.
But when she pop it, boy, you better run for cover. She moves her body like a cyclone, and she makes me wanna do it all. Body like a cyclone, just like a cyclone. She moves her body like a cyclone, and she makes me wanna do it all night long.
And you can see that for the most part this is the case. Part of the difference between the reference track is you can hear that my hi-hat is a lot more bright, and that's probably why it sounds too loud. And then also there are vocals in the reference track, which there aren't in my track. So you want the overall frequency balance to look about the same on the spectrum. You want to especially make sure that the bass matches really well, and then use your ears for most of the other sounds, because the other sounds should be a lot easier to use your ears for than the bass, especially depending on what kind of monitors or headphones you're using. But yeah, really getting a great result just comes down to really paying attention and listening very closely to get the levels of each sound and the stereo width of each sound and the frequency balance of each sound and everything about each sound to be as close as possible to that reference track whenever possible. So hopefully this video helped you out, and hopefully you have a better idea of what reference mixing is and how to do it.